Hi all, our notable game today is another fantastic game from the London Chess Classic. Levon Aronian was white against Veselin Topalov in round 7. Let's have a look at this mega clash. So Levon Aronian 2781, Topalov 2803. We see the English opening being employed by Levon Aronian. Symmetrical English, c5, knight f3, and black keeps the symmetry here, knight c3. Now black plays the more adventurous d5 rather than another symmetrical move in this position. We see d5. Okay, so now white actually took on d5. Knight takes d5. And this is a very interesting line here structurally and what is happening in this position. One of the more popular moves is actually just g3 here. So say g3, knight c6, bishop g2. This is fairly standard stuff. I mean, this is a Botvinnik system started up by Botvinnik. This approach against the English opening. But here in this game we have a sharper idea. Rather than g3, another move, which is the third most popular actually, is e4. Now ordinarily e4 would seem to mark out the d4 square more clearly for black in this position. If only black can keep a bind on the d4 square, isn't this a bit structurally weakening? Black actually plays now the most popular response, knight b4, heading for that d3 square. And if black gets this check in, unless white wants to give up the light square bishop, which looks pretty bad, white will forfeit castling. And in fact, here bishop c4 is played. And now we have knight d3 check. And yes, white is forfeiting castling rights. White usually plays the move king e2 here, prompting the knight to immediately move with the threat. The less popular move, for those theoretically interested, is king f1. It seems black gets, in theory, a good position here. You see that the d4 square is still marked out quite clearly by black, that grip there. But yeah, this is the idea. Usually king e2 seems by far the most popular. We're talking 160 games compared to just 4 with king f1. So very important, it seems, to kick the knight immediately. You might think, is there really such a subtle difference? Let's have a look at knight takes c1 here and knight c6. In this position, white gets to play bishop b5, pinning that knight, so tolerating the d4 square, and actually getting to play d4 here, and white should be fine breaking that bind on d4. So that d4 bind is important to black. Okay, so yes, if we go back to the game, so king e2 is by far the most popular. Check, king goes to f1, and white really wants to play d4 here, which also hits the knight on f4, of course. The knight goes to e6, keeping a bind on d4 for the moment. And it looks as though, so far, this has been quite an amusing game. The knight's gone round the roundabout here. 1, 2, 3, 4 moves. So what has black achieved? Black has stopped white's automatic castling rights. Black has a bind, it seems, on the d4 square, but we have 3 pieces here for white out compared to 1 for black. And an energetic move here is the most popular, b4. It is a bit like a Sicilian wing gambit type move. In the wing gambit, you play this often with an idea of getting the bishop on the dangerous, sometimes dangerous fianchetto line, diagonal. And here it's to undermine black's control of d4. Black usually takes this pawn. Protecting it is near disaster here because of this diagonal. White takes here first, for example, bishop d5. Ouch. It's bad stuff happens. So black usually just takes this pawn off after b4. And funny enough, the 2 main moves are knight e2 and knight d5. Levon chose knight d5. And it would seem, yeah, more aggressive to play knight d5 in principle. But the reason knight e2 is popular is because white's actually just wanting to get in d4 and maybe put the bishop on b2 still, yes, or play h4. This is a very popular continuation. Or the bishop can actually have the option of going to g5 here. It doesn't have to commit to the b2 square. So, but we see knight d5 in this game. So white reserves certain options. d4 or bishop b2 seem like attractive ideas. And in fact, after g6, the most popularly played move is bishop b2 here. And you might think, well, wouldn't you just routinely play this? The thing is about bishop b2, yeah, there have been 8 major games in live book with bishop b2. It is kind of natural, but black does have bishop g7 as a response because of the knight on e6. And games continue like this. And it's meant to be okay, actually, for black, this position. If white gets this pawn, it's no big deal here, it seems. Black's on the way to equality. But we see quite an unusual idea now in that bishop b2 isn't played. In fact, d4 is played. And white is content to get that d4 with the nice centre pawns here and maybe reinforce with bishop e3 if needed. We see bishop g7 and bishop e3 now to reinforce d4. And knight c6 brings more firepower to d4, but it is shielded with that knight on d5. So what is going on here after rook c1? How do we evaluate this position? Well, as a recap, black spends several moves rerouting the knight, b4, d3 to f4 to e6, to get 2 things: to interfere with white's castling and to get a bind on d4. The bind on d4 clearly no longer exists. Of course, black's a pawn up from the energetic b4 though. And it's a little bit uncomfortable for black because actually the rook on h1 can turn out to be quite handy, not just for peeling open the h file, but maybe even just for h6. So that's something to be borne in mind here. Black here wasn't too keen to castle kingside. In fact, maybe he was put off by the h4 h5 plan. Black delayed castling kingside here. Let's just do a little bit of investigation line on casting, which might be one of the better moves. It is one of the top engine moves, either casting or bishop d7. In fact, if we do have this h4, is this so serious? You'd think it might be, because that rook does seem extremely handy here. On h5, yeah, queen d2, and we've got standard ideas like bishop h6. It looks very pleasant, and if that is allowed h5, then again, this looks very handy to open up the rook here. It just seems like an attacking player's dream position. Maybe the king can just go to g2 and things can progress from there. Let's say this position, king g2, and then even the queen could shuffle across. So this is dangerous. You can't really go into this sort of position with black, especially without the defensive knight on f6. That this h-file could actually be spelling disaster here. So it seems more understandable that Topalov maybe, doesn't want to encourage this kind of hack attack. So he played bishop d7. He doesn't want to castle straight into it. We see queen d2. And again, though, there might be the idea, even if black doesn't castle for different reasons, for h6, to push the bishop back, to try and dominate the dark squares later. So this is still dangerous, this h4, h5 idea. And in fact, black here plays queen a5. It looks like a strange tactical basis. There's a tactical basis for this move. Let's just turn that off for a moment. That black has the possibilities of b3 at the right moment. But it looks a little bit as though white's having a much easier time of things here after h4. We see rook c8, and now b3 as an idea to swap off the queens and maybe take on d4 if possible looks like a dangerous possibility. And this b3 resource is shut down here with bishop b3. So white now enjoys a pleasant central position with his pawns and pleasant scope for his rook increasing with h5. We see check, king g1, and against h5, h6, black actually plays h6 now. So if h5, black is ready with g5 as a response, and this would seem okay for black. So what about this pawn now on h4? How is it going to be used? What is the rook going to be doing? Well, quite cleverly, some weaknesses have been created in black's camp. White artificially starts casting with king h2. Yes, he wants to bring the rook to the center. It's job done. Black's committed some extra pawn weaknesses. And here actually, you know, black can't castle because of that pawn weakness, because the bishop takes h6. Black actually plays a rather risky looking move here. It looks like a fairly unpleasant position. Black plays g5, trying to destabilize the d4 square. So incoming g4, and this is very, very tense now for black's strategy on d4. Reignited, it seems. White simply just supports the pawn with the rook. And here is a critical moment. Black here would seem as though the idea was g4 to undermine d4, because we have 3 pieces firing at the d4 square. So why doesn't black follow with g4? Black actually in the game played king f8, believe it or not. Let's have a quick look. Why not g4? It seems in this position white can use actually quite a powerful pawn sack. Knight e5, knight takes, rook takes c8, takes, losing a pawn with check, but it's no big deal here after g3, it seems. This position affords white with rich opportunities with a beautifully centralized knight on d5. If black tries to defend the pawn, well, first of all, if black castles here, then e7 will drop, showing the power of the knight. And if black tries to defend the pawn, then here bishop f4 is actually quite powerful. This position is really annoying and powerful for white. You know, if bishop g7, just to show a terrible continuation for black, this is mating black. So if takes, there's queen d8 mate, and king f8, queen d8. It's a very, very dangerous position indeed, this pawn sack line, showing up all of black's weaknesses. What is black actually going to do here? Is he going to castle and lose e7 followed by h6? A bit total disaster. So this is probably one of the reasons why after this move rook hd1, that g4, if you look at knight e5 quite closely, even though it loses a pawn with check, it seems to lead to a very favourable position for white. Black has so many weaknesses after that. So black played king f8 here, and now we see white continuing with the manual castling, getting away from the glare of the rook. So is the g5 pawn really under fire here? Again, black resisted the temptation for g4. He actually played in this position rook d8, but now g5 is a seemingly weakness of black's camp, and in fact it's taken here. Although it liberates the rook, we have now white calmly playing bishop takes g5, because the knight and bishop cooperate on the e7 square. So black can't actually take here, it seems, on d4. If black takes on d4, say knight e takes, then knight takes, and now if bishop takes, this is an overload position. Bishop takes e7 would seem strong, because we're taking on d4 and there's huge weaknesses to exploit on the dark squares. And same thing for knight takes d4. Well, we're going to take on e7, and then bishop c4 is strong, for example, followed by queen g5. This is really quite devastating for black. Here we're pinning the bishop, we're threatening all sorts of things. So yes, it seems after bishop takes g5, black is in big trouble here. And in fact, Topalov chooses knight takes g5, but after queen takes g5, again restoring the pressure on e7, ties black down. And white is actually potentially threatening now rook takes c6, followed by queen takes e7, winning the rook, which would be loose on d8. As an example, just to show that, say a5, rook takes c6, we just take here, take here. So black has to parry that threat now. and plays a forcing move, bishop h6, before we before we go on to bishop h6, if bishop e8, the strongest move here, this is a resourceful way to defend e7 against rook takes c6, because if rook takes c6, there's rook takes d5 as a response here, very tactical response, and black should actually be about equal, believe it or not, there. But in this position, if bishop e8 was tried instead of bishop h6, we have actually rook c5, and then here knight c7, and this gets very nasty actually for f7. For example, here kicking the queen, and now queen f4, threatening rook takes c6 for at the f7 for knight takes e8 and queen f7. This is devastating for black, this kind of continuation. So it shows some of the dangers that black has to deal with here. So bishop e8 would seem like a very resourceful defense, but it fails as well. So bishop h6 was played, and now the problem with this is not really screwing the rook, because we have a counter pin against h8. Bishop g7, and white has made a bit of progress here, getting queen now to f4, because this is slightly different now. White's queen is not sitting on the g5 square. White's queen is looking at f7 as well, echoing some of the other dangerous variations on f7. Black plays bishop h6 again, but now we have the difference being used. Knight g5 is now possible, using that g5 square, which the queen has vacated. Threatening queen takes f7 mate. So we have bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, and again this is just a horrendous position actually for black. Now if you remember earlier in the game, black had won a pawn, so the pawn situation, black's not a pawn down, technically it's equal on pawns, but here white still has these horrible threats, and black actually in this position resigned. Let's investigate here. Why does black actually resign here? Well, again, let's just reinstate previous ideas. If a5 is an example, rook takes c6 is pretty devastating, if nothing else. Just winning the rook on d8. Or not. Hold on a sec. King g7. Check. This is still good. Check. This is still pretty devastating, this position. So yeah, this is getting really dangerous. But in fact here, even stronger than rook takes c6, bishop c4. And where does the queen go? Say here. Rook d3. We're going to go into g3 and then to g7. What does black do about this g file here? This is the major threat now, rook g3. How does black actually parry this? Is he in a position to parry this? If here, check, we're going to use this g file, and it's going to be murderous. Yeah, there's major weaknesses in black's camp in this final position. Let's try a more sensible move here instead of a5. Say rook c6. Again, this idea rook takes c6 is dangerous to take here. It's an exchange sack. We get this queen e5 check, and one of the points is well, on f6 we can play the check and take on d7, so we're material up. And if the king goes to h7, again, like what we've just seen, knight f6, this kind of stuff is at least going to be winning back the exchange, where white has got numerous threats on the horizon, like this. This is horrible. Rook c1 threatening rook c5. This g-file weakness is being exposed again. For example, like this. Rook c5 is crushing. Yeah, this is going to be like mating that time after something like queen e5. If f6 here, these variations just show the king is extremely vulnerable. So yeah, it seems like a mysterious resignation here, but when you start to realize the number of weaknesses black has here, and this rook takes c6, it's just a very difficult thing to handle. On bishop e8, you might think, does this stuff work? This rook takes d5 counter response to take out the pressure on e7. doesn't work too well. E takes here. This position isn't good for black. White has a fantastic move in this position, rook e1, which scores a massive advantage, hitting e7. What does black actually do here to defend? If queen b7 d6, what does black do? Takes queen f6. So we're threatening mate here. If the rook moves, again, this is like a murderous position, absolute murder. Yeah, we're just taking the queen off, etc. So it seems, you know, this kind of position here is fatal for black. In fact, if f6, queen e3, how does black defend? If something like this, d6 is going to be murderous in this position. Look at the bishop being extended in scope. D takes e7 is threatened. If something like this, white is just having a great time attacking all the weaknesses. Again, there's just no real defense to this stuff. Something like this, it's absolute devastation. So yeah, it's a picture of devastation in the final position. It seems what, you know, the resources black has at his disposal are quite limited here. Let's have a look at bishop e6. Again, rook takes c6. What is black doing? It's tricky. Something like this. There's fantastic resources here. Knight f4, queen sack time. This is very good. Can get the queen back. Fantastic resources exist in the position. Yeah. So if we look at this final position, it's tactically, it's one of the richest final positions actually we've seen where the game's ended. But yeah, look at the various defensive tries, and they seem to all spell disaster here. We go into this again. Rook takes c6 here. What else do we want to try here? Again, if we take here this position, check actually is nasty here because there's knight f6 checkmate, and if the king rolls back to the back row, then queen takes d8. So we're starting to get a very clear picture that in the various variations here in the final position, this rook takes c6 resource is extremely dangerous. Rook e8, a sensible defense of e7. This position, we come back to the G file now. Rook d3, fantastic rook lift, is just devastating for black. This position, black is running out quite quickly for defensive resources. This kind of position, black is getting slaughtered. Threatening queen takes f7 mate. What does black do here? These variations just demonstrate different slaughter scenarios. It is a very rich position still, and maybe many of us wouldn't have resigned with black. Many of us would have tried to clarify things, trying a certain defensive move. But yeah, actually, Topalov, maybe he's not feeling quite right in this tournament. It seems he's already lost games before this round already, and doesn't seem to be having a great tournament. He just resigned here. He just assumes, yeah, it's pretty bleak for black. One more thing, just let's look at this. This doesn't really help. This position. The queen, where is the queen going? We get things like knight c7, harassing the queen again. Rook g5. That g file is just horrible. So yeah, it's a really horrible final position, which I think needed some explanation. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed looking at a few of those variations just to delve in here. With the king on f8, well, what does one expect with the king on f8? Fundamentally, the rooks are disconnected. The weakness on e7 and also f7 is echoed in some variations. These two pieces are conspiring with the queen. There's also the potential, as we've seen, for rook lifts and use of that g file. So there's multiple dimensions to the weaknesses of black's position in the final position here. Okay, I hope you got some ideas for your own attacking chess. If nothing else, comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.